Noted British historian and writer Katherine Schofield has long been enraptured by Hindustani classical music, so much so that she gave up her early training in the viola for Hindustani classical music, more specifically in the Khayal form. The passion has resulted in her latest book, Music and Musicians in Late Mughal India: Histories of the Ephemeral 1748 to 1858. Music being experiential and in the moment, especially before the invention of the phonograph, it is the ephemeral aspect of the music that was heard in late Mughal India during that period that has captured Dr. Schofield's imagination and scholarship. She chooses 9 unheralded musicians of the era, 5 men and 4 women, to offer a remarkable history of music and musicians in that period. Dr. Schofield spoke to Mayank Chhaya Reports from Cambridge to tell many charming stories, including one about an anonymous Indian musician playing the raga Dhrupad on the harpsichord. Dr. Catherine Schofield.
Dr. Schofield, welcome to Mayank Chhaya Reports. It's a great pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me ask the question that you asked at the beginning of the first chapter, and I'm going to quote you almost verbatim. How do we write histories of the ephemeral, of the tangible yet transient texture of the experiential moment? How indeed?
Well, this is the fundamental philosophical question of my new book, Music and Musicians in Late Mughal India. Its subtitle is Histories of the Ephemeral. And one of the things that I'm trying to get at is the fact that music absolutely captivates us, but it's time bound. It captivates us in the moment. And once it's passed away into silence, what is left? Can we recapture everything about that moment? One is used to working with material objects when you're doing history of all kinds, whether that be sort of receipts or historical chronicles or paintings. But how do you write histories of something like Hindustani music, which is improvised in the moment and where the experiences of that moment are very intense but momentary? How do you write that history? And this book is in a way an attempt to answer the question. And I frame it in terms of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. So for those of you who may have forgotten this myth or don't know it, Orpheus is the famous musician, the great musician of the Greek myths. And in Ovid's Metamorphoses, his wife Eurydice dies, and he's devastated by her death. And he goes to the underworld to get her back, and he has to cross the river Styx, and he has to play music to Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who guards the guard dog of Hades. And he manages to make his way all the way into Hades, where he plays his music so beautifully that the god of the underworld, Hades, says, yes, you can bring Eurydice back with you from the underworld on one condition. As you leave the underworld, you cannot look at her. You can't look back to see if she's following you. And so he draws her up out of the underworld, and he looks back at her, and she passes forever. So the question I'm asking is, can we use textual sources, traces of musical notation, paintings, the testimonies of historical listeners to get Eurydice back?
Right, indeed.
Basically, can we rehear her voice? Yes, and of course the answer, the full answer is no. Can never recapture it fully.
But at a very practical level, for instance, I was reading up, the gramophone was invented about 30 years after the period that you look at, 1748 to 1858. And like I said, it sounds rather mundane, but I'm going to say it nevertheless. After the invention of the gramophone, the question of music experience being ephemeral, in a sense, partly disappeared because you could replay it, right? And these days, it's become so easy to replay everything.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's something that you might look at if you were to ever write history of this time?
Yeah, it very definitely changed everything. So sound recording, the gramophone is, or the phonograph rather, is shown at the 1889 exhibition, which is 30 years after the end of this book, and in Paris, and the first wax cylinder recordings in India are recorded in the late 19th century, and of course then you get the gramophone expeditions, the commercial ones, which start in 1902. So you can hear Gohar Jan, you can hear Imdad Khan playing the sitar, from these very early recordings. So yes, it captures something, but it doesn't capture what it is actually like to be there, even on record. You don't even have the whole sound world, because sound bounces off walls and it bounces off people, and when it's improvised, as the rag is, yes, you can get that reproduced recording of that one instance, but it's not the instance that you heard at midnight, sitting at somebody's parlor.
This is fascinating. That brings me to the question: how did you, as a historian, enter that realm at the level of imagination, writing about the 110 years that you address?
Yes. So, in part, I mean, it is actually a work of empathy. I write about trying to be faithful to the musical dead, and I write as somebody who was once a musician. So I started life as a viola player. I had a job in an orchestra, and then I fell in love with Hindustani music, and that was it. That was it. I was hooked, and I think what really helped is that I do have some informal private training in Khayal, in singing the rag, and actually being able to understand from the rag from the inside. You can actually begin to, some of these, a lot of the technical treatises have notations that by the time you get to this period are very similar to today's rags. So not identical, but very close. And so you can begin to imagine your way into what it would sound like. And then you pick up on the ways in which listeners wrote about music and what it meant to them.
In a sense, what I'm getting from you is there was sort of reverse extrapolation from here now to that period.
Yes.
And you have to bear in mind that acoustics, as we understand now, did not exist then. There was, I suppose they did not sing on microphones. So it's all using natural barriers and other things to enhance their voice. Yeah. It's fascinating. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah. So, and this is something I'm actually very interested in. I'm interested in the spaces in which music was performed. And I've written another piece in my previous edited volume, Monsoon Feelings, about a lost rag called Gornd. And it's not the same as Gorn Malhar. It's a different rag that happened to be Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor's favorite rag. And he wrote songs in Brij Bhasha in this rag to be sung at Mehrauli, at the Zafar Mahal, and also at the shrine of Kutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki in Mehrauli. And of course, you can go to that shrine in Mehrauli and you can actually hear the qawwals singing. And the last time I was there, it was Ramzan. So they were actually singing without instruments and without any amplification.
I see.
And which would have been very close to what it would have been like. So that's something that you can do with, if you know the spaces in which things were sung. And so there's a fantastic music room in the palace at Bundi, for example, which is where, and the walls are covered in ragamala paintings and paintings of Nayaks and Nayakas and Radha and Krishna and so on. And so you can begin to imagine, once you need to take into account things like what people were wearing, because costumes actually change the acoustic. So do things like, is it the monsoon? Is it the winter season? That changes the acoustic. And the instruments were slightly different. So how might have that worked? I'm really interested in those questions. I don't actually really answer them in this book, but I'd love to move forward with that.
The way you were peeling the layers, these details wouldn't strike a lot of people. It's something like the kind of costume that you wear in summer or in winter.
Yeah.
It's heavier, so the sound travels differently.
Yeah.
The physics of sound changes, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. That's right. It changes very much. And actually so I was a viola player. Any string player will tell you that your instrument sounds different and is different to tune, depending on whether it's wet weather or dry weather. And that's very distinct in India. Right. But also we have these amazing paintings from the early 19th century of the Nawab of Jhajjar and his court. And there's a wonderful one that's in summer where everybody is in very fine white muslin. And his sitarists, he had Rahim Sen and Amrit Sen on his staff. And then we have an almost identical painting, but of everybody in winter costumes. And you can completely see the difference, all the furs and the velvets and all of these things which would have made such a difference to the sound.
You're bringing it alive, even as you're talking to me. I'm sure it's there in the book as well. To change track a bit from the viola to the Hindustani classical, that's quite a leap. Tell me a bit about that.
Yes, so it's a very long time ago now. It's 30 years since I had a job in an orchestra. I went to Conservatoire in Australia, which is where I'm originally from, to play the viola. And I rapidly realized that this wasn't really what I wanted to do with my life. I found it a little bit unintellectual for me, because you can get to a very high level as a Western classical viola player, and it's still the composer and the conductor telling you what to do. And I just found Hindustani music, the idea that it is the musician who is also the composer and the performer at the same time, is the intellect behind the sound, just incredibly appealing. And I switched lanes and I went to the School of Oriental African Studies in London. I was very fortunate that they had a music department there with a wonderful professor called Professor Richard Widdis, who is an expert on Dhrupad. He's written a wonderful book with Ritvik Sanyal, who's a disciple of the Dagar family, on Dhrupad. And yes, I've really never looked back. That was just incredibly compelling to me. But the other thing that was really compelling was that the stories that musicians tell about their lineages and how their lineages, stretched back to the Mughal court. Right. But also the stories that, more modern people tell about the Ustads, about them being illiterate, for example. Right. And one of the reasons why the period that I look at has never really been studied historically in the way that I've studied it is because people didn't think there was anything written down, because if the musicians are illiterate, they're not going to write anything down, are they? Right. And it turns out that actually they weren't illiterate. A lot of the main lineages of musicians were highly literate in Sanskrit, Braj Persian, later modern Hindi and Urdu, and they continue to teach Sina Ba Sina, from father to son, from Ustad or Guru to disciple. That's, fundamentally part of it. But they did also use writing for various reasons. And that's one of the questions I ask in this book is, given that they pass this knowledge on from, body to body in these chains, these living human chains, why are they writing things down in this period between the death of Muhammad Shah Rangila, who was the last Mughal emperor to have any real power,
Right.
and the uprising in 1857. Why are they writing these things down? And I mean, the obvious answer is that for the first time, in the middle of the 18th century, the imperial musicians scatter all over India, and they go to Lucknow, and they go to Jaipur, and they go to Udaipur, and they Hyderabad, and to Gwalior, and all over the place. And if you're a very, very long way away from your uncle, who is the main person who remembers all the songs, you can't say, Uncle Jafar, I can't remember the second verse. Can you please remind me? Write it down.
Yeah.
Or can you please remind me how we are related to Sadarang?
Right.
You can't that stuff is really important to remember against loss, and so that starts getting written down in this period by hereditary musicians, but also by their disciples who were minor noblemen and so on.
Right. The period of 110 years from 1748, what was the rationale behind that?
Yeah, so my previous work had actually been on the earlier material and on the 17th century. So the 17th century was when the canons of Sanskrit music theory really became written down in a new medium, if you like. So they start being written down in Braj Bhasha and Persian. Persian being a completely non-sectarian language, which everybody used. It was the official language of the Mughals, but the Rajputs used it, the Marathas used it. The East India Company used it until 1837. It was the official language for that long. We forget how important Persian was as a language. And so it moves into these two new vehicles to serve the needs of new connoisseurs who don't necessarily read Sanskrit, but who want to they want to listen to the ragas in the right way, because it's critically important to listen to each raga at the right time of day or season of the year. Otherwise, it could make you sick. I mean, they really did believe that they had supernatural powers, the rags, and for good or for ill. And so you need to listen to them at the right time. So this knowledge was really important to being a connoisseur. So I worked on the 17th century and just found a huge number of sources. And in the mid 2000s, a number of history books about Hindustani music and Carnatic music actually started being written about what happened under colonialism. And a lot of these books assumed that there were no sources before the 1870s, which I knew to not be true. And they also assumed that colonialism had a really outsized impact on both Hindustani and Carnatic music, that really these are colonial inventions. Or colonial era. Not invented by the British, but colonial era inventions. And some of the 17th century, so the things that rose to prominence in the 17th century, like Dhrupad and Khayal, they remain the icons of the most serious classical music all the way through the colonial period. And things that were regarded as trashy, like tamasha, continue to be regarded as trashy all the way through to the 20th century. Or not trashy, but something that you listen to in the bazaar.
Right. It's beneath a rarefied, sophisticated society.
That's right. So these differences, they're still there 300 years apart. And I just thought to myself, this cannot be the whole story. So I thought what I would do is focus on the transition between the Mughal Empire and the British Raj, because of course the East India Company comes in. I mean, they've been there since 1600, but they really only begin to gain serious power in the middle of the 18th century. We all know about the Battle of Palashi in 1757 and the notorious evil Robert Clive. and then the Battle of Buxar in 1764, which is when the Mughal Emperor actually gives the right to raise revenue in the state of Bengal to the British, to the East India Company. But sometimes we forget that actually after the uprising of 1857, in 1858, the British Crown decides that the East India Company has made such a disgusting mess of everything that they kick them out and take control directly, centrally. And so it's really that period, it's between the death of Muhammad Shah Rangila and then the imposition of Queen Victoria on the throne in 1858. That's and just asking the question, so how do things change in this period? How do these systems of knowledge interact? How are Hindustani musicians interacting with European patrons? How are European patrons considering this? But also, let's just ignore the Europeans entirely and look at what's actually happening, within these, sort of late Mughal cultures in Awadh, in Hyderabad, in Jaipur.
Right. During that period, you focus on 5 men and 4 women, which I found rather striking. How did you? I mean, it's very specific.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't know the names. I'm sure you do because I don't have the access to the material.
Sure.
Tell me a bit about the selection and the fact that there were 4 women in that era. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah. So, I mean, this of course is the era when the courtesan becomes really important. And we have new waves of courtesans coming through from the Northwest. And by the time they'd arrived in the Doab, they'd miraculously all turned into Kashmiris, because Kashmiris were meant to be much more beautiful and sophisticated. But most of them were actually from Punjab and from Afghanistan. So, the occasional Kashmiri, but they're very, very versatile, and so a lot of these women were coming through. But there were a large number of traditional courtesans from North India, and particularly what were known as the Kanchani at the Mughal court. But this really is the period in which we start getting large numbers of stories about musicians, and this is one of the genres that I focus on in chapter 3 of the book is a genre called the Tazkira, which means remembrances, lives, and on the lives of musicians. And I chose the lives of the musicians I found most interesting because of the particular stories. I'm just, holding up a picture. Beautiful.
It's lovely.
Man on the front cover. We actually don't know who he is. We don't know his name.
Oh,
it's
really?
Definitely a portrait of a qaval, a major qaval in Delhi in 1825, painted for the famous Eurasian mercenary James Skinner, Colonel James.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But so the first chapter focuses on actually stories that are told in the middle of the 18th century about a 17th century musician who was the great grandson of Khan Sen. His name was Khushal Khan, and he is blamed in this story for supernaturally putting Shah Jahan into a trance, because he was Shah Jahan's chief musician, and getting him to sign a piece of paper which meant that it doomed Dara Shikoh to death, to defeat by Aurangzeb. So Khushal Khan is blamed for the war of succession going to Aurangzeb, which is it's quite a fun story. It's about the power of music. The supernatural power of music to actually make or break kings. It's a really important story. And I talk about the fact that I think it's working as a cautionary tale in 1753 when it's written down, because we're just about to have Imad al-Mulk on the throne, who he's the one who murders Aurangzeb II, Alamgir II, and brings the Marathas in. So, but actually it's Abdali who wins that particular battle, the 1761 Battle of Panipat. So that's the first one. The second one is about 2 rival musicians at the court of Muhammad Shah Rangila. One, of course, is Firoz Khan Adarang, very well known to aficionados, Sadarang's nephew. And the other was his rival, who nobody knows about anymore, called Anjabaraz Khan. who was a direct descendant of Tansen. He was one of the chief musicians of Muhammad Shah's atelier, and we've forgotten all about him, but there's a huge number of stories about him written in his own time. So I'm talking about the rivalry and then how these musicians scatter all over India. The third chapter is the first one that picks up on one of these courtesans. Her name's Khanam Jan, and she starts out, we first hear of her in the British cantonment in Kanpur, but then she makes her way to Lucknow, where my second woman musician, a woman called Sophia Plowden, who's an English woman, she's a memsab. So this chapter is called The Courtesan and the Memsab, writes down her songs. And it's here that we get the first really clear notations of what these tunes may have sounded like, or what they sounded like to European ears.
Right.
Because she wrote them down in staff notation, but she also wrote them down she also had the texts written out for her. But this is also a really fun time for Indian musicians as well, interacting with Europeans. I just want to read you a little bit.
Please.
So this is from the courtesan and the memsab, and this is a completely anonymous male musician, hereditary Kalawan. So we don't know who wrote the treatise on the Hindustani rhythmic system, now designated Oriental Manuscript 585, number 4 in the Edinburgh University Library, nor do we know precisely where he was working or for whom. But in 1788, in Lucknow or Benares, or maybe Patna or Allahabad, one member of Anjabaras Kalawan lineage was engaging musically on apparently convivial terms with Europeans. They write in books of music, he enthused. They have another instrument of the string family that is extremely fine and noble, named the harpsichord. So inspired was he after playing this marvelous instrument that he gave the date of his treatise as this chronogram, which I'm about to recite, according unusually to the Christian calendar, along with the customary al-Hijri date. So I'm going to read it out loud because it resounds joyfully.
Okay.
Tanana, 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 tanana. Tanana, 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 tanana. Flute, harp, violin, fife, organ, harpsichord.
Oh, how lovely.
So the first line's set to this metrical groove that, using the new notation our musician had just borrowed from Perso-Arabic music theory, to overhaul how we wished Hindustani tals to be understood and written down in the modern era. For his second line, he set the names of 6 European instruments to his effervescent meter, reveling in the unorthodox feel of the English sounds in his mouth, that he carefully preserved in diacritical markings in the Nastaliq script, but most cleverly, when each was given its traditional numerical value, according to the Arabic abjad system, the Persian letters he used to transcribe these delightful Firangi words neatly added up to the English date of his manuscript, 1780.
Oh, this is congratulations. This is remarkable work.
Yeah.
I don't know how you've done all this. It's extraordinary. I'm struck by it. Yeah.
It's just amazing. So these little stories just fall out of these manuscripts all over the place, and they're just wonderful. And he goes on to have this very lengthy description of the harpsichord, which is actually really accurate. And he'd played it, and not only had he played it, but he'd played Dhrupad on it.
Oh, I see. So, imagine Dhrupad on the harpsichord.
Dhrupad on the harpsichord in 1788.
I'm just visualizing someone doing that. It's what a sight.
I know, it's absolutely wonderful, and I mean, it's not just that that Europeans were going sort of and writing down the songs of courtesans, Hindustani musicians playing the harpsichord, playing Dhrupad on the harpsichord, but also Indian music makers, instrument makers were repairing and making harpsichords and forte pianos in Calcutta in this very period. Right. So there's this real kind of moment of confluence. So that's that chapter. And then the next one focuses on the Ustad of the great Malaka Baichanda of Hyderabad, which most people will have heard of because she was the great courtesan at the court of the Nizam of Hyderabad. But her Ustad, Khushal Khan, was a prolific music treatise and ragamala writer. So I'm focusing just on what he wrote and what we can learn about Hyderabad and about their life stories from those texts. And then I move on to a completely wild chapter, which is completely different from all the others, on a courtesan called Mayali Dancing Girl. And that's almost all we know about her. She was a courtesan at Sambhar, at the lake, between the Salt Lake between Jaipur and Jodhpur, in the 1830s and 40s. And she appears in official colonial records. So this is the chapter that's actually on the India Office collections and the National Archives of India, and where performers come. And she's in the margins of an account book of the accounts of Sambhar Lake revenues, refusing to be paid cash instead of the salt stipend that she was due. So this whole chapter rolls out of this woman in the margin. Why is her salt stipend so important to her that she refuses to take cash? But also Jaipur and Jodhpur pay the British cash. Oh no, the British give Jaipur and Jodhpur cash, and they pay her in salt.
Oh, I see.
So it's so important to Jaipur and Jodhpur, to the Rajas, and to her that she's paid in salt. Anyway, yeah, this is all about the chapter's actually about a salt commons between Jaipur and Jodhpur and the goddess Shikambari Mata. And of course, there's a lot of salt also given to Govind Dev Ji as well through this. So anyway, so that's a bit. And the final chapter is about Mian Himmat Khan Kalawat, who appears also in this book by James Skinner, also in a beautiful painting like that, but he's named, and it's about paintings of musicians and other kinds of performers in this period, and ethnographic writings about them and what we do about them, and comparing them to his own biography from things that he and his disciples and relatives wrote themselves. And the final chapter is a kind of it's a concluding discussion, but we start with Vajid Ali Shah.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned him, because I was about to ask you about. I watch Shatranj Ke Khiladi randomly all the time. Every few days, I watch it from different places.
Yeah.
The idea of Utram, fascinated by Vajid Ali Shah's ways. It's such a tense dynamic, right? I mean, it's fictionalized, but tell me. I mean, since you talked about it, tell me a bit. Yeah.
Oh, it's so brilliant. Shatranj Ki Khiladi is a brilliant film, and actually, of course, one of my other favorites is Johnson, of course, with that wonderful sort of mehfil. But so Vajid Ali Shah, was this incredible impresario of music, dance, theatre. He revolutionized the singing of the Marsiya. And those the Shia genres. He revolutionized the singing of Tumri, although he wasn't the first to perform it or write it or have musicians singing Tumri, but he it became a genre synonymous with him, with, of course, the emergent Parsi theatre. Indo Sabha was came out of his court. Just the first writings on what became known as Kathak dance actually are in his music treatise, which he wrote in 1853 called Sultan Mubarak, the blessed sound and blessed song. That first descriptions of gut nikas are in there. So just this incredible entrepreneur. But of course, the British despise him for it, and they write all these incredible things about how debauched he is, because he marries all these women and he spends all his time with musicians and dancers and so on. But if you think about it as about the sovereign power imbued in the rag from the Mughal period onwards, this is the last space in which he can actually be the king. It's the last space where he can exert his sovereignty, because the British have taken over everything else. He can't exercise lawmaking or sort of any of these things, because the British won't let him. So they keep saying, oh, you're so debauched, but they won't let him do anything else. And so that's why he spends his time doing it. And when he is sent into exile by the British in 1856 and they dethrone him, the people of Lucknow follow him out, and legendarily singing the Tumri Babul Mora.
Right.
And it is actually Awadis who fight the hardest against the British in the uprising just 1 year later because of this insult to their king. They still saw him as sovereign. So there's this really, there's this interesting tension there between his incredible engagement with music. And we of course we have his own memoir, the Ishqnama, and there's a beautiful illustrated copy of this, which is now in Windsor Castle, and which of course was looted from London.
Indeed, yeah, we don't even have to say it, right?
But it's a beautiful illustrated copy of him with all his the women he married who were all musicians and so on. And there's this amazing painting of him with Sarafraz Mahal, who was one of the courtesans who he married, and she is dancing, and his throne is empty, his chair is empty, and he stepped off the throne to play tabla for her.
I see.
And directly behind him is his favorite, Ghulam Raza, who's known for the Raza Khani Gut, this sitar player from Rampur originally, who then, after all of this, ran off with Sarafraz Mahal. So all this kind of stuff,
These are such remarkable stories.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a book sitting there right there for you on Vajid Ali Shah at some point.
Yes. Well, actually, I don't need to do it because there's a wonderful new book on Vajid Ali Shah and his music and dance and performing arts patronage by Richard David Williams. It's published by Chicago University Press, and it's called The Scattered Court.
Oh, I must check it out. Yeah.
He looks not just at the court in Lucknow, but also in Metya Burj and what happens in Calcutta up until Vajid's death, and then after that as well, his legacy. So phew.
Yeah. Just last question, Doctor.
Sure.
You mentioned the fact that the period that you look at coincides with relatively less consequential Mughal rulers, because the empire was fading.
Yes.
But these rulers followed 222 years of the Mughal rule that started with Babur.
Yeah.
I'm especially interested in the Akbar-Tansen dynamic, how that might have embedded music and musicians as part of instruments of statecraft for the Mughals.
Yes, that period is hugely important, and it's clear that even by within his sons and grandsons' time, that period is being looked back at as the moment of foundation and consolidation of raga-based music at the Mughal court. So it's important to remember that the Delhi Sultanate goes back to the late 12th century, and that the sultans of Delhi all had Hindustani music at their courts, or raga-based music. It wasn't known as Hindustani music then, the ragas. But Babur was only emperor for 5 years, and he came with his Central Asian musicians and so on. So he wasn't really interested in rag. Humayun, of course, spent most of his reign in exile in Iran. So it's really Akbar who comes in, and for him, this becomes the music that he loves. And it's Abul Fazl, Akbar's great ideologue, who writes the first chapter on music in Persian for the Mughals, which becomes this foundational text that then gets repeated in all these later texts as the kind of this is the canonical information. Right. This is what you need to know. This is, and then it's quite clear from Abul Fazl's chapter on Sangeet, which is in the Ain Akbari, that this was Sanskrit Sankita Shastra that is not just there as a kind of a theoretical frame, but it's being mediated to him through performing musicians, including this great stable of musicians from Gwalior, So
Right.
Khansen and his colleagues and sons.
Right. To conclude, you write, and it really struck me, and I'm quoting him, okay, quoting you here. Yeah, you say that even before the Mughals arrived, ragas were already richly aestheticized objects of erudite connoisseurship associated with India's courtly and literate social classes.
Yeah.
Now, that's a remarkable observation. Tell me a bit about that before I let you go.
Yeah, sure. So, so in the late 15th century, we have this incredible conflation of this of the this is the century after Timur comes in and
Right,
sacks Delhi in
right,
1398, and we get these independent sultanates. We get the Tomars in Gwalior, and we get the Sharkis in Jaunpur, and we get the Rajas in Mewar, and we have a number of and the sultans of Gujarat, and we have a number of really important music treatises written in this period, not just in Sanskrit, but also in vernacular languages, like the vernacular language of Gwalior, which some people call Madhya Deshi, but it's it's like Braj Bhasha, and these are really the one that's done in Gwalior in particular. Rajaman Singh Tomar says, "Okay, we are going to bring together all the experts, and we are going to decide on which ragas go with which raganis, and we're going to have an official canon." And he sets this all down, and yeah, and so it's actually all there,
right.
by about 1500.
Now, that's amazing. Do you continue to sing?
I do.
You
Yes,
do?
but
Uh,
largely only to my son.
may I be so rude as to ask you to give me a bar from Khayal, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Anything that you like.
Sure.
That would be wonderful.
Okay, so I'll sing you a little bit of one of the ghazals of Hafiz,
Oh,
which
wonderful.
Khanam Jan, this great courtesan of Lucknow, sang
Okay.
to Asafudullah and his mehfils, and we have the tune in English notation,
Okay.
but I've sort of modified it, because we also have the lyrics, and the lyrics give a kind of a seven beat. So it would go something like, "Moche bikhoshnawa bego taza bataza no bano barai dil kusha bejo taza bataza no bano," which means sing, sweet voiced musician,
Right.
ever fresh and ever new.
How
And
lovely.
it's
How
a
lovely is this?
yeah,
Oh, this is so nice of you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope it was worth your while.
absolutely.